Welcome, everyone. I'm Linda Yueh. It is my absolute pleasure to chair this fantastic panel. Now, I can't tell you how excited I am that we have gotten this collection of people to come here and solve all the issues around globalization in the next hour or so. It is simply a superb panel, and I think we're addressing one of the most important questions, really, of our time. And this is really about thinking about the question of globalization. Is the consensus breaking down? What has happened to our attitudes and our approaches and the future of globalization, which has been such a big part, I think, of all of our lives? So, without further ado, let me introduce this terrific panel. So to my right is Jason Furman. He's professor of the practice of economic policy at Harvard's Kennedy School and the former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Obama, and is now the chair of the Digital Competition Expert Panel reporting to the Chancellor and the Department for Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy. And next to him is Lucian Cernat. He's the chief trade economist at the European Commission, where he's in charge of economic advice on EU trade policy, influencing over 4.5 trillion euros of EU trade flows annually. And then to his right is Jean Boivin. He's the managing director and global head of research at BlackRock and the former deputy governor of the Bank of Canada. Next to him, Ian Stewart. He's the partner and chief economist at Deloitte, UK. And he leads the very influential quarterly CFO survey on UK corporate sentiment and strategy. So, great panel. Let's just kick off. So the very first thing I'm going to ask each of them to address is actually answer the question, globalization, is the consensus breaking down? Jason.
So thanks so much for having me here. It's great to be here, especially on this topic. And would start answering that question by telling you I lived in Washington for about 14 years. Only once did I see people setting fires to cars in the street in what was essentially a riot. That was in the year 2000, plus or minus a year. The unemployment rate was incredibly low. Wage growth was incredibly high. It was pretty much among the best economies the United States has ever had. And those riots were against globalization. There were much bigger ones at the WTO meeting in Seattle in the year 2000. So the first part of my answer is there never really was a consensus around globalization. And in fact, if you had to say there was a consensus, the consensus was probably more that like foreigners were stealing our jobs and terrible than that it was a good thing. So I think that's the first part to know. The second thing, though, is there has been a general trend of increased mistrust of elites, of increased disintermediation of information. People get it from their friends on Twitter and Facebook rather than from, the Financial Times or The Economist. And just a general growing, suspicion about foreigners, immigrants, everything. And so I think you take a constant sort of worry about trade and a constant worry about globalization, and you layer on top of that that the elites just are less in charge of it now than they used to, and that means a lot comes out. So I think that's the second most important factor. The third, I think, is the economic situation has contributed to it. The financial crisis, the prolonged consequences of it. The entry of China into the global economy was a massive one-time event that I think is actually in the rearview mirror. Now it's sort of more of a steady thing than a massive growth. So I think the economic factors have exacerbated everything I've said, but I think they're less important than the baseline distrust of globalization combined with the growing distrust of elites across the board, not just on this topic.
Thank you, Jason. Lucian.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Linda, for inviting me here. I'd like to say from the outset, as a disciplined bureaucrat, that my views expressed tonight are going to be purely personal, and they do not necessarily reflect, they may not actually reflect at all the official position of the European Commission or its 28 still member states in that universe. Now, going back to your question, I think when you say, has there been ever a consensus on globalization, or is it broken down now? Has it been broken down for a long time? I think you have to phrase it a little bit more specifically, because in many respects the answer is yes and no. I mean, in different, I think, epistemological kind of circles, I mean, among economists, you see, I would agree entirely with Jason. So among different people with similar background, similar worldview.
And I was speaking for the Commission, by the
way. you would have a consensus in many respects. But then across society at large, of course, you'll have a huge divergence. I mean, if you have a blue-collar worker who lost his job without necessarily know because of which exact force, is it imports from China, is it technology? Of course, the view of that individual and the view of a PhD economist may not diverge on the immediate and the long-term prospects of globalization. So we had this dilemma and this kind of cleavage in society for a long time. I agree entirely with Jason. Now, why is it now a more acute question that brings us all together here on a panel? Well, for several reasons. I mean, we have had for a long time a set of stable institutions which recently have lost a little bit their relevance and their esteem and their legitimacy for good or bad reasons. We have a US president who is actually easy to read. You just have to have a Twitter account and then you can actually read. But it's hard to understand and follow. Then you have tectonic shifts when it comes to the share in the world trade or the world GDP of emerging economies. So again, the institutions haven't really adapted to the new face of the world, and that even among bureaucrats or people with enough understanding of globalization, not just people who are affected by globalization, you get different opinions. So I think it's a critical moment for us to reassess the way we bridge the gap between reality, this evolving reality, again, for the next 10, 20 years, and the way we've been managing globalization through a number of rules and institutions.
Thank you very much. Jean.
So good evening, everyone. Very happy to be here as well. So I mean, we've already started, and we should start to disagree at some point, I guess, more openly. But with the starting point that which Jason and Lucian have laid it out, I kind of agree that, and I would agree in particular with this distrust of elite as being the, I think, the fundamental question, and where the consensus is being questioned. I guess my question, though, is whether this has anything to do with globalization. I mean, just to be provocative, I think it has something to do with globalization, but people like simple narrative, and globalization is being used, I think, in a very large or like, encompassing way. And a lot of the issues that Jason has mentioned could be happening without talking about trade or international relationship. I mean, it could be within a country. It could be about technology disrupting a segment and how the government or the institutions are dealing with that. So we can come back and explore that a bit more. But at the end of the day, I think the big question is it really about globalization, or is it something more fundamental about how democracies are working and whether they're really representing? And ultimately, to me, this is about dealing with big adjustment and shocks. They could be about trade, they could be about technology, they could be about demographic, and it's how to deal with that. It's about distribution question, and ultimately this is a lot more about political science than economics. But we have economists, I guess, largely here on the panel, so we'll take this angle.
Thank you, John. Ian.
Okay, so. I mean, I think actually views on globalization, or what until about 20 years ago was called trade, have always been quite contentious. And so in British politics throughout the 19th century, one of the big fault lines was over attitudes to free trade. And, it was a massive issue, the question of whether trade should be liberalized to the benefit of consumers and to the detriment of landowners and producers of agricultural goods. And actually, about half a mile from here, there's a statue to one of the campaigners against the Corn Laws, which restricted imports. And that was a great progressive cause for free trade. And
they won the day in 1846.
They won the day. The Economist magazine was one of the, actually was sort of set up at the time of this campaign. So trade And globalisation was seen as a progressive cause, but it's been a fault line in British politics. The choice between the empire and the world versus a kind of more sort of insular view, and that's never gone away. And I think it's the same globally. I mean, so it's like views on the market. I mean, views on the market have changed tremendously in my lifetime. I think the other thing is that the pace of globalization has changed over history. There was a period of frenetic globalization in the late 19th and early 20th century, and then there was stagnation until from the First World War until the 50s. And I think we are comparing the world today. We've come off the back of a period of incredible globalization associated with the collapse of communism, China's entry into the WTO, creation of the single market, the single currency. And so I think anything after that was going to be a disappointment. But when you have an almighty recession, I think that you then expose some of the stresses in the system. And I mean, the panelists will know what the numbers are, but I mean, American median incomes, at least for men, have been stagnating since the 1970s. It's not as if there haven't been stresses. Inequality, actually not in the UK, but otherwise globally, has tended to rise in the last 10 years. So I think it's the collision of the financial crisis with some of the stresses that have emerged around incomes and inequality, which has kind of triggered the debate. But I really don't think this is different. I think we've been here many, many times before in this endless debate about liberalisation versus regulation.
Jason, I want to probe a little bit about, there has been obviously a lot of discontent. I mean, in fact, I think Joseph Stiglitz wrote a book in the early part of the 2000s called Globalization and Its Discontents. I think it was published in 1999. But what specifically, why is globalization particularly contentious? Is it because of wage stagnation? So we know that the distributional impact of trade is one of the causes of discontent, where you feel you have losers. And, so just talk us through what you think why it's such a focal point.
Right, yeah, so every month in the United States you get the jobs report, and it might say something like 200,000 jobs created last month. That's the net number. They might as well have reported the gross numbers, in which case they would have said 2.3 million jobs were destroyed last month, but fortunately 2.5 million jobs elsewhere in the economy were created. And that's something like the magnitude of what you see every month. If you ask people what their feeling is about job loss due to technology versus due to managerial incompetence versus due to changing demand, all of those they're actually pretty content with, and it doesn't really bother them. If you ask people what they think about somebody who lost their job because the factory moved overseas or it was displaced by imports, that really upsets people. And they just react very differently to the two. Now, it depends a lot on how you frame it. No one gets upset if you lose jobs because you improved a port. But because you struck a trade deal with China, that's quite upsetting, even though both of those are quite similar. Like improving a port is like lowering tariffs. It makes it cheaper to bring things into your country and send things out of your country. So I think, even though the majority of job loss is due to those first three factors, technology, changing demand, and managerial incompetence, the one that is the smallest of them is the one that is just salient above and beyond all of the others. And it also tends to lead to the reaction. No one says, let's have less technology because there's technological job loss. If there's trade-induced job loss, people tend to say not like, oh, we should help those people out, but, oh, we should actually stop that trade. So it just is processed in a very different way. And then there's more of it. With the entry of China, it really was quite a large shock to the US and the global economy, the types of which we hadn't really seen before, and I don't think we're going to see again.
So I've certainly heard about technological change, demand obviously changing, but managerial incompetence, this is...
not anyone from here.
No, clearly not. But Lucian, let me pose a similar question to you, because obviously trade is your day job. So what are some of the implications from these challenges to trade? Maybe because, as Jason says, people just react more. It's more, it's just more of a lightning rod than, say, technological change. Because as we know, obviously, especially around wages, technological change is actually a much bigger factor than trade. But you don't really blame robots. Well, not yet. We will blame robots. We don't really blame robots, but we blame trade.
Yeah, no, I've got now a new line of defense. Next time trade will be, and trade policymakers will be the scapegoats for everything that goes badly in your life. I will say, well, Jason just mentioned managerial incompetence as a much more important factor. So I'm already delighted. I have a main takeaway out of this event, and I'm very grateful for that. But joke aside, it is true that because people think that technological change is not something that a particular group of people, advance with an explicit aim to create inequality. Technological progress actually has been the greatest force for human prosperity. So it's hard to be against technological progress unless you're a Luddite. So then what comes next in the line of fire is policymakers, and then trade policy is really very visible. We also have a lot of attention to trade deals. We tend to have these high-level head of state photo opportunities. But it's true at the end of the day, and I'm happy to say that in a humble way, trade is not as important as people think, at least those who criticize us for all the evils in the world. I mean, if it comes to the kind of buzzwords we've already heard so far, I think they're very relevant. I mean, the reason why globalization has been so much under pressure is because of a number of things. I mean, we heard this reality versus perception. There is reality and there is perception, and perception can be affected by many things. And people perceive globalization as an unfair process. So there is unfairness in the perception. Maybe even in reality there may be some unfairness. Some people accuse certain countries who are very big players in the world economy of not playing fair this game. And there is this level playing field attitude. People blame, this wage discrepancy, lax environmental standards, all sorts of things that they say, how can we compete with countries if we don't play by the same rules? And then there is the job losses. But if you contrast perception with reality, there's been a Eurobarometer, one of these big surveys we do in Europe, when we asked people, what's your opinion on globalization? Are you afraid of globalization? Do you think globalization is a good thing? And the funny thing is most people would say, no, I think globalization for the world is a very good thing. More than half of people say, I think globalization has done good to the world. But when you ask them, but to you as an individual, do you think globalization did something good to you? They would say, well, I'm not so sure. I'm actually very afraid of globalization. So there is this uncertainty what's going to be the impact on you as an individual. It probably comes through the wage and the job losses, not necessarily through the benefits as you having access to a great variety of things, cheaper goods, trade, we know all the benefits from trade. So it's this job losses probably that's at the end of the day a critical element. And as economists, I have to also do a little bit of mea culpa for a very simple reason. Later than yesterday, we launched the most important trade and jobs report in Europe. We managed to quantify the number of jobs in Europe that are supported by exports. And it's a huge increase from 2000. It's, I think, even from the last time we measured, it's almost 4 million jobs more supported by trade. 36 million jobs in Europe. 1 out of 7 jobs in Europe are actually dependent on our ability to engage with the rest of the world and export. But then the very first question I receive every single time I mention this, and I expect you to ask me, that's why I will answer it in advance, is that, okay, fine, these are exports, but how about imports? How many jobs you guys, with your reckless trade policy, have actually destroyed in Europe? Because the underlying hypothesis is that exports are good and imports are bad, which is fundamentally wrong. But because people start from that assumption, they pressurize us to say how many jobs have imports killed. And of course you cannot answer that question because the premise, the first hypothesis is wrong. and because it's a much more complicated equation to solve. So it's not because we don't know or we don't want to actually say how much it is. It's because it's extremely complicated. So we are left with this half of an answer to a fundamental question, because in Europe, like in the US for many years nowadays, you cannot talk about trade or globalization if you don't end the phrase with jobs. So we have to be part of that debate, except that for many reasons, we have methodological problems. So we only have partly answered the question, but it remains a fundamental question.
Thank you. John, I'm going to ask you to take us through sort of a more, maybe a kind of a broad sweep of globalization trade, really dating back to about the mid-1990s. So obviously you've been involved at the G20, with kind of politicians, they get together, and obviously the WTO being set up in 1995 was a culmination of the Uruguay round. There was this tremendous feeling that trade, globalization, is something that leaders ought to be supporting. So I'd just be interested in your take from that and sort of some of the issues that have already been addressed, because obviously we should make clear that one of the big beneficiaries of globalization for many decades were actually emerging economies who got to access new markets. And part of the reason for their strong growth since the early 1990s was their global integration. So I'm thinking Eastern Europe, the Berlin Wall coming down. You remember when end of communism, some of you were not born then, so just nod. Remember the end of communism in 1989, the reintegration of Eastern Central Europe, this feeling that the market economy, and India turning outward after its 1991 balance of payments crisis, open door policy taking off in China in 1992, all of these things. I think the 1990s felt, at least at that point, where globalization felt to be contributing to maybe prosperity, but perhaps prosperity elsewhere and not necessarily in the West.
So I'm from Canada, and there's some aspect that you could, in many dimensions, you could are similar to experience of emerging markets, I guess, even over that period. So in Canada, we've been, very actively seeking trade agreements since the 1990s. We're a big pusher for the first trade agreement with the U.S. that led to NAFTA. And I guess one interesting point I would make on this is that there's always been, a divide around trade, and that has been playing out very intensely, I guess, to some extent in political debates. But ultimately, I don't think it has led to the level of resentment that we're seeing now, or the the kind of political narrative that we're hearing now. But I think the big impact of negative impact were felt earlier in Canada in the 90s. We've seen some big impact of this. We are heavily exposed to the dollar movement. The trade, the car industry has been suffering through the ups and downs of the Canadian dollar or throughout the 2000s. But at the same time, it never reached a level of animosity against trade that we are seeing now, I think, globally. So this is one point I would make based on your. So I guess I'm coming from an environment where pro-trade, pushing for these even more. CETA was the last thing I was involved. Was a different world. It's only the
Canadian EU Free Trade Agreement.
So, thank you. I was helping negotiate on the financial sector side, and that was only 2014. That's and the narrative was completely different. So that's one point. A second point I would make is in terms of the G20, and I don't know, Jason, if you have a different experience, or Lucian, but the China shock that we're talking about now, which I think some academic colleagues, David Otter and others, have helped to make real, and I think very compelling, is not something that was obvious until I would say recently, even though that started to happen early 2000.
Thank you. Ian, companies are increasingly global. So is there a disconnect between how companies see the most competitive, so the studies show the most productive companies tend to be exporters, and being a globally competitive company is a part of the strategy of lots of big companies in Britain and elsewhere. Is there a disconnect between that and what we've just heard in terms of the views of globalization among people?
I'm not sure there is. I mean, it's certainly the case that exporters and companies which invest overseas are much more productive than their peers who don't. So in the UK, foreign-owned companies are about 70–80% more productive than British companies. So anyone who says that the big problem is that you can't solve productivity in the UK until we sort out vocational training and infrastructure, they're talking nonsense, because you've got companies that are operating alongside each other with very different productivity rates. And actually, talking to people who deal with companies in difficulty, as I do, overwhelmingly the problems of the corporate sector relate to mistakes made by corporates. And this stuff isn't rocket science. I don't actually think globalization is quite as unpopular as maybe we're suggesting. I mean, Trump's a complete outlier. There aren't really mainstream politicians in the West who take the same view as him. And Canada and the EU, Japan and the EU, I think in July struck what probably was the world's biggest free trade agreement. Trade deals are still taking place, and public opinion, I think in aggregate, isn't as negative as perhaps we maybe suggest. It isn't that there is discontent, and I think the discontent is understandable, because what you have seen is that the distribution of gains from growth have obviously they're always unequal. But they have been particularly disadvantageous for certain types of workers, and I think we have a society where the divide essentially lies around education. We have no problem with the quantity of work in the UK. Even in the UK, despite Brexit, we are awash in jobs. We've reached full employment. I've been travelling around the UK for the last fortnight, and across the whole of the UK, there are skill shortages, recruitment difficulties. Companies are trying to work out how they can get hold of more people. I mean, we've been phenomenally successful at creating jobs. I think the real issue is around the distribution of gains from work and the quality of work. And those things, we would be having this debate with or without globalization. I think globalization is an easy target. But I think there are much more profound issues about the role of the state, about regulation, about taxation, about the share of GDP going to profits versus labour. So my view is that maybe some people, globalisation is a convenient target. I think there are real issues around incomes and inequality and people who are outside the mainstream, but I think that is not principally because, as the other panelists said, I think it's to do with technology and it's to do with the market.
Thank you. Before we open it up to questions, I want to have another round where we're going to talk solutions, changes in approaches, different approaches perhaps, to try and make globalization either more palatable or acceptable or work better or address some of the other issues that have been raised. So, Jason, what's the solution?
I don't think there's a solution, but three things would make it better. Number one, a more robust social safety net. Shouldn't be trade specific. It shouldn't matter whether you lost your job due to managerial incompetence or due to foreigners. Either way, you should have health insurance. You should have support to find another job. You should have training if you need it, et cetera. And the empirical evidence is countries that have more robust social safety nets are ones that are more open to trade, places like the Nordic countries. That's the first thing. The second thing is just a broader set of economic policies that will increase economic growth and help make sure growth is shared. So I'm sort of cheating and saying the answer is everything. I don't think we have dials that are going to radically change economic growth or radically change inequality. Even if we changed it a bit, it's not going to make everything go away. As I said, in 2000, we had a lot of problems too. But I think we could do more. And one of those dials actually is expanded trade and expanded economic integration. The third thing is the way we do globalization. And here, my own views have evolved a little bit. there's a sort of pure economic view of, let's say you're confronted with dumping and other countries sending its stuff to you at really cheap prices. The thing you learn in economics is that the right policy response to that is to send the other country a thank you letter. Because you just got all this stuff for cheap, and it costs them money, not you. I think trade needs more political legitimacy. So things like anti-dumping, surge, rules like that, that I used to think were overused and problematic, I'm a little bit more sympathetic to them. I think the way we negotiate trade agreements, the critics are not all wrong. The US trade agreements, for example, the pharmaceutical industry had disproportionate power in terms of how they were negotiated. They had more access to the negotiators, more ability to write the terms. So making trade agreements a little bit more inclusive and dropping some of the things that sort of like investor-state dispute settlement, which I think is a perfectly defensible provision, drives everyone crazy. It's not important enough to drive everyone crazy. So do globalization in a way that might be 90% is good economically, but 110% is good politically.
Thank you. Lucian.
I was thinking, should I add 3 more things, and in the end you will get 12 or 15 things, or should I just elaborate on what Jason has so rightly mentioned already? So I'll do a little bit of both things, trying to elaborate, probably add 1 or 2 things. I mean, I think even when I look around in the room, and every time I go to an event and I try to justify what most of the things we do are well-intentioned, and even the results are actually quite good in the end. We're not perfect, but we're trying. When I look around and people get a bit of a skepticism on their faces, and I even detect it tonight on some of your faces. I'm probably not good at face reading, but I'm sure there's some skepticism in the room. And then I ask myself, oh, there must be a way to make globalization cool again. I mean, it is a great thing. If you think about
just giving yourself a task.
Globalization is, in plain language that a teenager would understand, is freedom. I mean, it's about your ability to do things across borders, your ability to enjoy things that come from far away, you going far away. Not just goods, it could be a digital, in a digital world, it could be traveling, it could be many things. So why is it that we have such a negative attitude to globalization? And I think there are problems with globalization. We need to address them. Jason said, well, job losses. Yes, fine. We, for instance, have in Europe a policy instrument that has globalization in its name. It's called European Globalization Fund. I bet a drink to each and every one of you haven't heard of it. And maybe there's a good reason why, because the UK has actually exercised its sovereign right, and they Brexited out of this instrument many years ago. This is the one single instrument that the UK refused to apply. There were money waiting in Brussels, specifically earmarked to help people in every single member state that they've lost their job in case there is massive job losses with some criteria in every member state. And this money, we have now the ex post evidence. We did thorough monitoring, and it turns out that for 150,000 people, with an average of 4,000 per capita, we managed to actually put them back to a job that they don't hate more than the previous job. And that 60–70% of them, they managed to keep their job after 1 year. So these are undeniable metrics that the program works. It was underfunded, for sure. But it worked, and we're trying to improve it. I mean, if we were talking about the benefits of globalization, I did a back-of-the-envelope exercise. In Europe, only counting what we do, trade agreements, if we put them all together, in the long run, we expect the EU GDP to be 2 percentage points higher than if we wouldn't do these trade deals, right? Now, I challenge you to go and look for the budget that we allocate to this European Globalization Fund, which would be, if you want, the price to pay to make everyone happy. There will be losers out of globalization. Not every single firm in Europe will benefit from the EU-Japan FTA. It's a great deal. Even the one with Canada, it's a great deal. But will every single firm in Italy or in Portugal expand as a result of this trade deal with Canada? I bet not. Do I know which one will not and will probably shed some workers? I don't know. But when they show up and say, I lost my job, if it complies with the European Globalization Fund criterion, they will get this social safety net that we all in Europe have actually put together to deal with globalization. So that's one thing. We don't do much about it. And we don't redistribute enough. I mean, out of the 2%, I think we probably distribute the third decimal in percentage points. So it's really peanuts compared to what we would need to spend to make everyone Pareto optimal kind of happy, right? We have the means to do it, and we shouldn't deny it. I would be the first one not to deny it, unlike other trade officials, I guess. Now, there is also a problem with the rule book. I mean, I go back to one of the first things I said. If people believe that the globalization process is unfair, maybe there is some truth to it. Maybe if you look at the way some things, I mean, anti-dumping, in Europe, we don't go by the textbook. In Europe, we just reinforced anti-dumping for the simple reason that while writing a thank you letter to the other country, we have to actually pay for unemployment benefit for some people who lost their job. So, of course, probably the benefit for the continent will be much bigger than the losses of those people. But do we know how to compensate? I just told you we don't. So we can't just play around and say, no, don't worry, because they will find a way around it. No, typically they don't, unless you have very good policies, as you said, very good software. But at the end of the day, if we want to get legitimacy for those few institutions that govern globalization, and WTO is one I know very well, we need to tighten the rule book. I mean, there is no general agreement on all the kind of subsidies that countries can engage with. Take services. The new oil is data, people say. Services is the largest share of every developed country's GDP. Mm-hmm. Try to search in the WTO rule book for rules that will prevent countries to engage in unfair subsidization. You will find none. Is that something we should address? I think so. So anyway, I'll stop here because there are many ways. But I think we need to put the rules in place that will make people trust again globalization. And if we redistribute enough, maybe it will become cool again.
Thank you. Jean.
This is great. So make globalization cool again is stealing one from Trump's playbook, I guess. I won't repeat what has been said because I agree, and I would just emphasize that I think it's not about necessarily if it's about trade or something else, but there needs to be a way to deal with the redistribution of adjusting to these shocks. And I think the trade aspect that was mentioned by both my colleagues here is crucial. I find it interesting that you raise ISDS or investor-state dispute settlement mechanism as one, because that's been a very thorny issue, and I think this is an interesting tack that you've suggested here. So the only thing I would emphasize beyond this is I'm not sure we would be here talking as much about discontent, what was it, the word you use, this distrust of elite, if the financial crisis had not occurred. So I think that the financial crisis is one of the key reasons we're still politically dealing with the legacy of the impact it had in terms of redistributing wealth. I do think that there still is lingering risk aversion that is continuing because of the financial crisis. So I think we have less investment now because there's still a bid for safety, which we see day in, day out in the way our clients are behaving. And as a result, I think this speaks to two things. One is we need to the extent we can, mitigate or avoid as much as we can the repeat of those situations. I mean, it's a wishful thinking to avoid it, but to find ways to mitigate that, and not only because they lead to massive redistribution of wealth when they occur, but also because growth is still lower today, in my view, than what it would have been otherwise. And that speaks to, I think, I mean, there's concrete things to do around the financial system to continue to build the resilience. And I'm a central banker, so I see implication as well for central bank policy. And I'm not sure that collectively, globally, central banks are fully taking on board financial stability consideration. And I think that's an important part of even that feeds into what we're discussing today.
Thank you. Ian, how do you, what would you propose in terms of how businesses might think about changing their approaches towards globalization?
But I mean, I think we need to accept that destroying jobs and destroying companies is an essential part of the capitalist system, and it's actually a beneficial process. I mean, sort of speak up in defence of destruction.
What's known as creative destruction?
Well, I mean, it's inevitable and beneficial, and it's like 70 years ago in the UK, about half of all jobs was either digging stuff out of the ground or making things, and now it's about 7%. it's like we destroy huge numbers of jobs. And whenever anyone says to me we're living in a period of unprecedented change, I'm inclined to disagree. I mean, our grandparents lived through incredible change. I think the problem is when losses are sustained and concentrated. And that is exactly what we've seen. This isn't a non-problem. It's a real problem. And I think the other thing that particularly Brexit and Trump have exposed is just how useless economists and policymakers are about understanding the distribution of these gains. So, we were sitting in London on the evening of the Brexit vote, watching markets rally and the betting markets. So it was a done deal. In fact, I went to a party to celebrate the Remain vote in Hampstead. I'm in a very appropriate metaphor for this. And
I'll tell you my Hillary Clinton party later.
And what that? But everyone I was talking to who had actually bothered to go outside outside London said actually there's a different narrative now. Angus Deaton and Anne Case at, I think, Harvard, wrote a paper, which I really would recommend everyone looks at it, because there's a very good Vox summary. I think it was last year. But it was a fascinating thing, because it was an attempt by economists to say, well, actually, let's try and understand the source of this, some of the sources of this discontent, and look at what's happened to life expectancy by ethnic group and by income. And the findings were horrific. They talked about deaths of despair, about sharp falls in life expectancy for middle-aged white manual workers, and all that stuff was just we didn't understand that stuff. So actually all economists agree that we need to do more measurement. We love measuring things, but I think that is a real point. And actually, in terms of what we do. There is no debate that I've had about productivity and about kind of social inclusion which doesn't end up with a long discussion about skills and education. And I think the response of society in the last 150 years to technology has been to raise the value of human capital. We've been really very good at that, but in this country there are two egregious gaps. One is vocational training, and we've been getting that wrong for 150 years. You can read Royal Commission reports from 1860 where they've gone around Europe and lamenting the awful state of vocational training relative to Europe. And the second thing is secondary education, basic literacy and numeracy. We should be, for our income, the UK should be towards the top of kind of international league tables of literacy and numeracy, and we're not. Those things are, in my view, far more cost-effective than, dare I say it, university education. And so I think one of the big things that's going to come out, actually...
He's disinvited.
I should have said this earlier, but these are all personal views. But I do think that we have probably hit peak university in this country. And the combination of overcapacity and fees and questionable returns to degrees, so you get a third of all male graduates earning less than they would have got had they not gone to university. How about that for a return on your education? 99% of women actually raise their income by going to university. So I think we're going to see much greater discrimination. I think this will be a good thing, and I think we will also see a greater willingness by young people to do things other than go to university. It's become a fetish in this country, and it's not good for the economy or indeed for opportunity.
I'm not sure if I should say anything. How would you come to LBS without a university?
Except in elite institutions, including the London Business School.
Thank you.
And all Russell Group universities.
Thank you. He's just saved the situation. Okay, the floor is now open.
We don't get to hear about the Hillary party?
You can ask about it. There's a microphone which is coming around. If you raise your hand, catch my eye, introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, and pose your question succinctly and tell us who you like to answer it, and we'll get in as many questions as we can. So the gentleman there.
Perfect, thanks. Robin Carzon from Canada, LBS, proud alum. I wonder if the panel...
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks to the panel. I wonder if they might comment on the rise of media technology over the last 20 years, of course, rise of the internet, rise of mobile, and rise of social media, and how whether that maybe not affecting globalization, but affecting the impression and view of globalization among the population?
Yeah, great question. Jean, you're nodding, so do you want to have a crack at it?
Okay, that's a trick to nodding.
Don't nod.
No, I think this is I mean, I'm not an expert in social media, actually, to be honest. I don't quite get it yet, but I'm getting up to speed now. But this is...
Somebody create a meme of him.
But this is, I think, if you think about, like, I don't think, as Jason was saying at the beginning, those riots were happening a while back. The debate were already happening. The difference now is, you know, there's a different way to spin things. And I think it's pretty material. I mean yeah, I think this is, and I'm sure Susan has lived it even more closely than I have recently, but it's, I think it's a big factor in rise of populism.
Oh, interesting. Jason?
Yeah, I agree that it's just, you know, democratized communication, and I'm enough of an elite myself that I think there's an advantage to gatekeepers, and what rises to the top of your Twitter feed or your Facebook feed is not necessarily the article that was fact-checked and balanced.
Thank you. There's a question here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Christiana Amafidin. The first question that I have is actually aimed at Ian. And you said that we'd reached full employment. What does that mean? The other point that you mentioned about developing human capital. Outside, I know we're in a university, please don't judge me. Outside of formal education, what other ways do you see as an effective way of developing human capital, especially for the world of work in, you know, the information age?
Yeah, so actually the really interesting question is to ask an economist what he thinks an 18-year-old should study at university. The default answer in this country is say STEM. I mean, I think there's quite a good argument that you should do
engineering,
sorry, science, technology, engineering, maths. I think there's quite a good argument you should go to America and do a liberal arts degree. I think to answer your question, I mean, I think what's going to happen is that we are increasingly going to see education as not a period that ends with graduation or when you've done your postgrad, but the boundaries between work and education will break down in a way which is quite beneficial. I also think that we are very bad at measuring the things that are really useful in the workforce and increasingly valued, which are relationships, creativity, versatility. And actually at Deloitte, we are placing less weight on where you went to university and the degree you got, and we're doing more in terms of testing people and actually measuring their skills. So I think this is a challenge for employers, but also for what employees do.
So, by the way, one super fast thing to add to that, if you look at the United States at least, the number of jobs in STEM are actually going down, and jobs are going up in the professions that require management, creativity, interpersonal relationships, all the things that machines can't do.
Yeah. Interesting. And just on your first question, so full employment is just measured as the ratio of people who are employed over the working age population. And so full employment basically says this is, you're now growing at the potential rate of the economy, this is the number of employment you ought to be having. So what it doesn't really capture is those who are not in the labor force. And then, of course, if you want to look at the flip side of it, which is unemployment, unemployment is an official measure. It doesn't measure things like if somebody has a part-time job but really wants a full-time job. So in the US, that's measured as U6, which also picks up a few other categories. So I think, yes, I think some of these statistics, once you look behind them, as you're rightly doing, you'll see the areas in which they pick up and the areas in which they don't quite pick up disguised unemployment or hidden unemployment. So that's why you get a debate over full employment. Great. Yep. We got tons of hands. So I'm going to try to keep we only have about 10 minutes. So I'd be really grateful if we collected these questions. And then if you keep your questions brief, I'll try and get answers out of these guys for you.
Okay, thanks. I'll try and keep it brief. Cathal Graney is the name. I'm in the LSE and I also have a software business. So I just wanted to ask, like in the last century or a little more, we've had a kind of three-way geopolitical battle, you know, up to 1945, kind of two-way battle up to 1990, and really it's kind of that painful phase of experimentation, geopolitical struggle. You could say that it's kind of over. So why do the panel think that since 1990 there hasn't been more of a concerted effort to establish kind of a global governance? And a kind of a related question is on the private side, why, you know, you could have said that up to that point there could have been some kind of argument or rationale for why judiciary and government kind of tended to lean towards corporations, you know, letting them off the hook a little bit in terms of, you know, social responsibility and so on. So just really, why do we think that there hasn't been more of a push for global governance at a basic level?
Thank you very much. Question here?
Hi, I'm Ranjit, and I work for IBM. So one of the consequences of globalization has been trillions of dollars in untaxed profits that remain in tax havens. So my country, the United States, Europe, are not getting the benefits of these, you know, profits, these money that should have been invested in education, you know, welfare, etc. So how can we, from a policy side, from a legal side, you know, force these corporations to bring these untaxed profits back into America and Europe?
Thank you. Great question. Yeah. Then, yeah, these two. And then go ahead.
Hi, my name is Archana, and I'm from Imperial College London, and my question is for Jason. How would you approach the mistrust of the elite that you had mentioned in the United States, especially in regard to the regional fragmentation that we see in terms of the coasts and the center of the United States?
Great. Thank you. And the lady in front? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Alex. I am an LBS alum. I think we talked about what policymakers could do, and I think probably in the room we're probably net benefiters of globalization. Is there anything that we can do individually to play a role in, you know, promoting the benefits or maybe contributing to the redistribution in a way of the benefits of globalization?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Okay.
My question is related to the low taxation orthodoxy.
Okay.
To what extent low taxation leads to a more integrated, more globalized economy? Okay. The reason I'm asking is because some of the most globalized economies are Nordic, Scandinavian countries. Thank you.
Yeah, they have high taxes. Yep, okay. And then final question there.
Thank you. My name is Joel Hamilton. I'm an energy engineer, that's what I'm currently called. So one thing that hasn't been touched upon, and I'd like your opinion on, is what role does sustainability have in all of this? As globalization up until now has generally been perceived as something that isn't sustainable because it's about continued growth, whereas it could, in theory, actually lead to sustainability when you've got everyone working together on a level playing field.
Thank you very much. Great questions all. In the interest of time, I'm going to allocate these a little bit. And so, Jason, there was one that was actually posed to you about mistrust of elites and regional differences.
I wanted to answer one of the ones I knew the answer to. But I'll take a stab. You know, one is, you know, elites have made certain mistakes, and understanding some of the downside, some of the costs, some of the inequality, all of that, I think is part of it. I think part of it is, you know, not trying to do the economically perfect, but worrying more about political legitimacy and the trade-off between political legitimacy and the economically, or in other areas, perfect. I think, you know, it's possible that some of this is just a transition to a new way of communicating, and we're not used to it yet. So when the radio was invented, you had all these populists on the radio mesmerizing people. You know, the rise of Hitler wasn't unrelated to, you know, new forms of mass media and mass communication. And you know, then we sort of learned how to interpret those and what was true and what wasn't. So I think that's part of it. I think the platforms have a role and need to do a lot more than they have done to date in sort of patrolling. You know, they're basically an awful lot like publishers, but not accepting some of the responsibilities. So I think those are some parts of the answer. But I think it's an incredibly important question.
Thank you. Lucian, can I get you to comment on tax havens and sustainability?
together. Well, I'd like to actually, in the end, combine a few of the questions in
Yes,
hopefully still a comprehensive answer. I hope you understand what I mean with these. I mean, there's been one about the global governance. I think at the end, they all relate back to your question about global governance. The problem with global governance is that it works much slower than everyone would like, and for reasons I'm not going to elaborate, but you have to take it as a given. I mean, global governance takes time to develop, to deploy, and then to sustain and improve. I mean, we have now a decay, a deterioration of global governance, but we have also some successes here and there. The Paris Agreement, I would call it a success of global governance, and it's linked to sustainability. Not everyone is willing to sign up to it. I'm not going to mention again.
Except for the U.S., Syria, I think.
Well, Syria's now in it, actually.
Syria's now in it, okay.
Yes, so you see, we need to be patient to reach that kind of consensus or a critical mass. So that's why plurilateral agreements would probably work very well. Tax havens, we have OECD, an acronym that is not as famous as the WTO, but still they do very good work. They have guidelines on tax havens. We, in Europe and in the US, whether you like President Trump or not, some measures were taken. Is it perfect? Is it? No, far from it. But again, I think these are things that now we see we are at a stage where we can no longer sustain them. Some actions are being taken, and they're far from being perfect. Now, what else would I offer in this mix? Probably more leadership. Seriously, for many years, the world didn't have enough leadership. Now we see it here and there. They just need to have the guts to probably go ahead, even if they have to lose an election later on.
Great. Jean, I'm going to try again with you on since sustainability. Well, actually, no, Lucian actually covered quite a lot of this. I'll just let you pick and choose as well. And then I'll save the question about low tax orthodoxy for Ian, just to pre-prepare him.
So I'll go on just 2 words on the sustainability question, which I think is hugely important. I mean, there's been an attempt to bring that front and center. I think, G20, even the FSB has done a lot of work to explain the risk. And this is not only about doing good things for impactful, but it's also because we have risks that we need to mitigate that will have, financial implications. So I think this is becoming a lot more real. The dynamic has changed over the last couple of years, clearly. One thing that I would relay, though, is that from my perch where we are, there's a momentum that comes from the clients. Our clients are asking for ESG impactful investment solutions. It's part of it is driven by regulations that some of the institutional investors are required to make sure that they can show that they are respecting some ESG criteria, but there's a broader change that is not only top-down forced by regulation, but it's really now starting to be and the new generation, the millennials, are willing to sacrifice some returns in order to have some impact in the way they're investing, much more than previous. This is changing, so I think this is one aspect that I would highlight. And I don't know if we have more time. The more difficult question was what people should do here. Right. So I don't think we should let it go, but I don't know the answer. The only thought I would offer is, I'm struggling personally, and I think we all are trying to grasp this world we're in. I think the social media question that was asked at the beginning is a big part of what's happening, and there's I think perception of playing a much bigger role than reality used to. And I think we need to recalibrate that. And that means understanding better the true, genuine disgruntled that is there, which may have been overlooked, but also making sure we stay on the reality as we try to manage that. And maybe that involves doing more of the ed balls, going to Trump America and trying to understand what's going on there. Maybe that's not the only way, but I think that's the kind of ideas.
Yes, Ed Balls, the reinvented Ed Balls.
Can I add a very quick footnote to that question, which I believe is indeed very important, what every one of us could do individually. And since this is a business school, let's talk about what individual businesses could do in order to say globalization was a good thing for us. One of the most difficult things for us in Brussels when we want to showcase the positive aspects or any aspect of a free trade agreement is to find a willing company who would be on record saying, I am an exporter to Canada, and thanks to this agreement, my sales to Canada increased by X%, and I even hired 5 more people because I had to expand production. For some reason, this is the most difficult thing to actually pin down. People are reluctant to be on record. For reasons I don't understand, to say, yes, I am a beneficiary of globalization. It seems to be a shameful thing to admit it.
Ian, quickly on the low tax, if that's okay.
Oh, I'd rather. Can I answer another one? Well, I mean, I think we'll get the tax system that people want. And actually, answering a different question, I think the role of public opinion is really, really important. So at Deloitte, which is, it's a profit-maximising business, it's amazing how many people come to us and they want to talk for jobs, and they want to talk about purpose and sustainability and reputation. People of my age are generally rather kind of surprised by that. But I think we should take this seriously, and it has had, I mean, I see this in the corporate sector. There has been a really big response to the financial crisis by large corporates. They are very, very concerned about these issues. In terms of tax, I mean, things are already happening. The climate has changed. I mean, the OECD, the BEPS initiative has had a very big effect. The tax authorities in this country have become, there has been a real shift. So I don't think we should underestimate the extent to which the corporate sector has actually taken on board the message and the kind of concerns, the sort of concerns we've discussed today. Just in terms of what we could do, one thing that I think we must all remember is that, I mean, probably everyone in this room is a believer in fundamentally in this globalized system, technology and the market. It's really important that we understand the casualties and don't disparage them, because I think one of the mistakes that people who are supporters have tended to be rather disparaging of those who are on the wrong side of history.
That was terrific. We are out of time, but we have 1 minute. So instead of asking about the future of globalization, I'm going to ask you a yes/no question. So, can globalization be rolled back? We're going to start in reverse order. Ian?
No.
John?
No.
Lucian?
It depends.
That's such an economist answer, isn't it? Jason?
We'll need to watch the United States and find out what the answer is.
Wow, I actually think these are going to be great talking points over the reception. But please, we are out of time. And I guess let me just say a final word of thank you to this terrific panel, who I just thought were so great at discussing these issues in a mixture of serious and light, and I think it was just completely enjoyable. And of course, to thank Patrick Spencer and Baird for sponsoring these Big Ideas in a Changing World series. These are really terrific series, and I'm really delighted that you're helping us put these on. And to thank all of you for your wonderful active participation. But before all of you can go, you have to join me in thanking this super panel.